The first pale light of dawn crept through the oiled parchment window of Thomas Aldrich's shop, casting long shadows across bolts of wool cloth and gleaming brass scales. It was the year 1347, and the cobblestone streets of Canterbury were already stirring with the sounds of medieval commerce. Thomas stretched his aching back, having slept on a straw mattress above his mercantile establishment, and prepared to face another day in what we might recognize today as England's emerging middle class. But calling Thomas middle class would have puzzled him greatly. In medieval England, society was traditionally divided into three estates: those who fought the nobility, those who prayed the clergy, and those who worked everyone else. Yet by the 14th century, a new social stratum was emerging between the peasant farmers and the noble lords merchants. Skilled craftsmen, successful innkeepers, and prosperous traders who possessed neither noble blood nor vast landed estates, but wielded considerable economic influence nonetheless. Thomas belonged to this rising merchant class, a wool trader whose family had gradually climbed from humble beginnings to modest prosperity over 3 generations. His grandfather had been a shepherd. His father had learned to read and write and became a wool factor. And now Thomas owned his own shop, employed 6 workers, and could afford luxuries that would have seemed impossible to his ancestors. The medieval middle class lifestyle was a far cry from our modern suburban dreams. Thomas's day began before sunrise, not by choice but by necessity. In a world without electric lighting, daylight hours were precious commodities that determined the rhythm of life. He would rise from his simple, better wooden frame with rope supports holding a straw-filled mattress covered by woolen blankets and immediately check his strong-box, a heavy iron chest secured with multiple locks where he kept his most valuable possessions, silver coins, important documents, and samples of the finest wool. His morning routine began with personal hygiene practices that might surprise modern readers. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people were not universally dirty or unconcerned with cleanliness. Thomas would wash his face and hands in a basin of cold, water-heated water was a luxury, reserved for special occasions, and clean his teeth with a twig frayed at one end, sometimes dipped in salt or herbs for freshening. He would dress in a linen undershirt, woolen hose that tied to a belt around his waist, a long-sleeved tunic that reached his knees, and a hooded cloak for warmth and weather protection. The clothing of the medieval merchant class reflected their social position with careful precision. Sumptuary laws regulations governing who could wear what restricted certain fabrics, colors, and styles to the nobility. Thomas could afford good quality wool and linen, but silk, purple dyes, and ermine fur were forbidden to him by law. His garments were well made but deliberately modest, signaling prosperity without overstepping social boundaries that carried serious legal consequences. Breakfast was typically a simple affair: bread, ale, which was safer to drink than water, and perhaps some cheese or preserved meat. The medieval diet varied dramatically by season and social status, but successful merchants like Thomas enjoyed more variety and better nutrition than the majority of the population. His pantry might contain imported spices, dried fruits, and salted fish luxuries that demonstrated both his wealth and his connections to far-flung trading networks. After breaking his fast, Thomas would descend to his shop on the ground floor of his building. Medieval urban architecture was practical and space-efficient. Shops occupied the street level. Living quarters were above, and storage areas filled every available nook and cranny. The building itself represented a significant investment. Most merchants rented their premises, but Thomas had managed to purchase his property outright. a sign of his growing success. The shop itself was a marvel of medieval retail design. Heavy wooden shutters would fold down to create a counter extending into the street, essentially turning the entire front of the building into an open-air marketplace store. Goods were displayed both inside and outside, with the most expensive items kept safely within reach, but the bulk merchandise arranged to catch the eyes of passing customers. Thomas specialized in wool cloth, but like most medieval merchants, he also dealt in whatever profitable goods came his way: metal tools, leather goods, imported wines, or exotic spices from distant lands. His workday began with inspecting his inventory, checking for damage from moisture or pests, and calculating what needed to be ordered, sold, or moved to different locations. Medieval record-keeping was surprisingly sophisticated. Thomas maintained detailed accounts in Latin, tracking not just sales and purchases but also credit arrangements, partnerships with other merchants, and complex international transactions that might take months or years to complete. The business of being a medieval merchant required skills that extended far beyond simple buying and selling. Thomas needed to evaluate the quality of raw wool by touch and sight, understanding the subtle differences between fleeces from various regions and breeds of sheep. He had to negotiate prices in multiple currencies and Lish pennies, Flemish groats, Italian florins, and calculate exchange rates that fluctuated based on political conditions, seasonal demands, and the unpredictable hazards of long-distance transportation as the sun climbed higher and the streets filled with customers, servants, and fellow traders. Thomas prepared for another day of the complex social and economic interactions that defined medieval middle-class life. His success depended not just on his business acumen, but on his ability to navigate the intricate web of relationships, regulations, and expectations that governed his world. The sound of church bells marking the canonical hours would punctuate his day, reminding him that time itself was measured differently in medieval England, not by the mechanical precision of clocks, but by the ancient rhythms of prayer, work, and rest that had governed Christian Europe for centuries. Thomas Aldrich was living through one of history's great transitions, as commerce and craftsmanship began to challenge the traditional foundations of medieval society, creating new opportunities and new anxieties for those bold enough to seize them. Margaret Aldrich stood in the the private family chamber above the shop, directing the morning activities of her household with the practiced efficiency of a woman who understood that her family's social position depended as much on proper domestic management as on her husband's commercial success. In the medieval middle class, the boundary between home and business was virtually non-existent, and a merchant's wife played a crucial role in both spheres. The Aldrich household consisted of Thomas and Margaret, their 3 children, John, age 14, Eleanor, age 12, and baby William, just 8 months old, 2 apprentices, 2 domestic servants, and occasionally a journeyman craftsman or traveling merchant who rented sleeping space in the attic. This arrangement was typical of prosperous merchant families, standard households that blurred the lines between family members, employees, and business associates. Margaret's day began even earlier than her husband's, as she supervised the servants in preparing the day's meals, checking the household accounts, and ensuring that the family's clothing and linens were clean and properly maintained. Medieval housekeeping was an enormously complex undertaking that required knowledge of food preservation, textile care, herbal medicine, and basic chemistry. A successful merchant's wife needed to be part nutritionist, part pharmacist, part accountant, and part diplomat, the medieval middle-class home was designed for both comfort and functionality. Though comfort by 14th century standards would seem Spartan to modern eyes. The Aldrich family's living quarters occupied the second and third floors of their building, with the solar serving as the main family room where they ate, entertained guests, and conducted private business. This room contained the household's most valuable furniture, a large wooden table, several chairs, a luxury that many families couldn't afford. Most people sat on benches or stools, a carved chest for storing valuable textiles, and a small writing desk where both Thomas and Margaret kept their records. Medieval furniture was built to last and designed for multiple functions. The great table could serve for meals, business meetings, and household crafts. Chests doubled as seating and storage. Even the beds were multi-purpose during the day. The bedding would be rolled up and the bed frame used as a couch or additional seating for guests. Privacy was a rare commodity. The concept of individual bedrooms for each family member was unknown, except among the highest nobility. The family's diet reflected their social status with remarkable precision. While peasants survived primarily on bread, ale, and vegetables, the Aldrich family enjoyed meat several times per week, fish on Fridays and during Lent, and a variety of imported delicacies that demonstrated their connections to international trade networks. Their breakfast might include white bread made from expensive wheat flour rather than coarse barley or rye, butter, eggs, and small ale. The main meal of the day, served at midday, could feature roasted meat, fish pies, vegetables cooked with imported spices, and wine diluted with water. Food preparation was an elaborate process that required careful planning and considerable skill. Without refrigeration, preservation techniques were crucial. Meat was salted, smoked, or pickled. Fruits were dried or made into preserves. Vegetables were stored in root cellars or pickled in brine. Margaret needed to understand which foods would keep longest, how to detect spoilage before it became dangerous, and how to combine ingredients to create nutritious and flavorful meals from whatever was available in each season. The medieval middle class was acutely conscious of social distinctions and worked carefully to maintain their position between the peasantry below and the nobility above. Clothing, food, housing, and behavior all served as markers of social status, and the consequences of getting these signals wrong could be severe. Sumptuary laws prescribed exactly what each social class could wear, eat, and own, and violating these regulations could result in fines, public humiliation, or worse. Margaret's clothing reflected her family's prosperity while remaining within legal bounds. She wore a linen chemise next to her skin, a woolen coat, a fitted dress that laced up the back, a sleeveless surcoat for additional warmth, and a veil or wimple that covered her hair. Proper married women never appeared in public with uncovered heads. Her garments were well made from good materials, dyed in colors that were neither too bright, which would suggest noble pretensions, nor too drab, which would indicate poverty, and trimmed with fur or embroidery that demonstrated wealth without exceeding her social position. The children's upbringing was carefully planned to prepare them for their future roles in society. John, as the eldest son, was destined to inherit the business and had been receiving education in reading, writing, mathematics, and commerce since age 7. He could already perform basic calculations, write simple letters in both English and Latin, and evaluate the quality of wool with a trained eye. Eleanor was learning the domestic skills she would need as a merchant's wife, household management, textile arts, basic medicine, and the social graces necessary for entertaining customers and business partners. Education, for middle-class children, was a luxury that set them apart from the vast majority of medieval society, while most people remained illiterate throughout their lives. Successful merchant families invested heavily in their children's schooling. John attended the cathedral school for several hours each day, learning Latin grammar, arithmetic, and the basics of theology and natural philosophy. Eleanor received private instruction at home from a local priest, focusing on reading, writing, basic mathematics, and the religious education considered essential for all Christian women. The family's relationship with their servants reflected the complex social dynamics of medieval households. The two apprenticed young men from rural families who were learning the wool trade were considered part of the family and treated accordingly. They ate at the same table, received clothing and shelter as part of their compensation, and could expect Thomas to help arrange their marriages and establish them in business when their training was complete. The domestic servants occupied a more ambiguous position, essential to the household's functioning, but clearly employees rather than family members. Medieval servants performed tasks that required considerable skill and responsibility. The cook needed to understand nutrition, food safety, and complex recipes that might require exotic imported ingredients. The housemaid cleaned, mended clothing, helped with childcare, and assisted with the elaborate process of laundry, a multi-day undertaking that involved soaking, beating, boiling, and drying clothes and linens. Both servants could read and write at a basic level, skills that were necessary for their positions but unusual among the general population. The social life of a medieval merchant family revolved around business relationships, religious observances, and civic duties. Thomas and Margaret entertained other merchants in their solar, hosting dinners that combined pleasure with business negotiations. They attended church services regularly, not just because of personal piety, but because religious observance was expected of respectable citizens and provided important social networking opportunities. Thomas served on various municipal committees and trade guilds, responsibilities that enhanced his reputation and provided valuable political connections. The medieval middle class lived in a world of carefully calibrated social relationships, where every interaction carried implications for business success, family reputation, and future opportunities. Understanding these complex dynamics was essential for anyone hoping to prosper in the emerging commercial economy of 14th century England. The clanging of hammers on metal and the rhythmic thud of looms filled the air as Canterbury's craftsmen and merchants began their daily work. By the 14th century, English towns had become complex economic ecosystems where specialized trades and sophisticated commercial networks created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility. The guild system that governed this world was both a ladder to prosperity and a rigid hierarchy that determined who could practice which trades and under what conditions. William Fletcher, a master carpenter in his 40s, represented another face of the medieval middle class, the skilled craftsman who had transformed raw talent and decades of training into economic independence. His workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Mercery Lane, where the sounds of sawing, planing, and hammering announced his trade to potential customers. Unlike Thomas Aldrich, whose wealth came from buying and selling goods produced by others, William created value through his skilled hands and intimate knowledge of his materials. The medieval guild system was perhaps the most distinctive feature of middle-class economic life. These organizations combined the functions of modern trade unions, professional associations, quality control agencies, and social welfare systems. William belonged to the Carpenters' Guild, which regulated every aspect of his profession. Who could learn the trade? What techniques were acceptable? How much members could charge for their work? And even what tools they were allowed to use. The path to guild membership was long and carefully controlled. William had begun as an apprentice at age 12, bound by legal contract to serve his master for 7 years. During this period, he received food, shelter, clothing, and training in exchange for his labor. The apprenticeship system was designed to ensure that guild secrets remained within the organization while providing masters with cheap labor and young men with valuable skills. After completing his apprenticeship, William had become a journeyman, literally someone who worked by the day journey in French. For another 7 years, he had worked for various masters, perfecting his skills, earning wages, and slowly accumulating the tools and capital necessary to establish his own workshop. Only after demonstrating his competence by creating a masterpiece, a finished work that proved his technical ability, had he been admitted to the guild as a full master craftsman. The guild system created a complex hierarchy within the medieval middle class. Masters, like William, owned their workshops, employed apprentices and journeymen, and participated in guild governance. They were small business owners who enjoyed considerable social prestige and economic independence. Journeymen were skilled workers who earned good wages but lacked the capital or opportunity to establish their own businesses. Many remained journeymen throughout their careers, forming a kind of skilled working class that existed between the masters above and the unskilled laborers below. Guild politics were intensely local and deeply personal. The Carpenters' Guild met monthly in the hall they owned jointly, a substantial building that served as both meeting place and symbol of their collective prosperity. Guild members elected officers, set prices and quality standards, resolved disputes between masters, and made decisions about accepting new members. These meetings were exercises in medieval democracy, where successful craftsmen debated issues that directly affected their livelihoods and social status. The economic relationships within William's workshop illustrated the complex social dynamics of medieval craftsmanship. His 3 apprentices came from different backgrounds. One was the son of a rural carpenter who hoped to learn urban techniques. Another was a merchant's younger son who would never inherit the family business. And the third was an orphan whose guild membership fees had been paid by the town's charitable fund. These young men lived in William's household, ate at his table, and were subject to his authority in both professional and personal matters. The 2 journeymen who worked for William occupied a more independent position. They rented sleeping space in the town's numerous boarding houses, earned wages that allowed them to marry and start families, and maintained relationships with other masters who might offer them better opportunities. Their loyalty to William was primarily economic rather than personal. Those successful masters cultivated long-term relationships with skilled journeymen who enhanced their workshops. Reputation. Medieval craftsmanship required not just manual skill, but also sophisticated knowledge of materials, tools, and techniques. William could identify different types of wood by sight, smell, and touch, understanding which species were best suited for specific applications. He knew how to season timber to prevent warping, how to join pieces without nails or glue using only carefully cut joints, and how to create furniture that would last for generations. His tools, saws, chisels, planes, and measuring instruments were valuable possessions that he had acquired gradually over many years. The variety of goods produced by medieval craftsmen was remarkable. William's workshop might produce anything from simple agricultural tools to elaborate church furnishings, from basic household furniture to decorative items for wealthy clients. Each project required careful planning, precise execution, and an understanding of the customer's needs and social position. A table made for a merchant family would be different from one created for a noble household, not just in size and materials, but in decorative details that reflected the owner's social status. Quality control was a serious matter that could make or break a craftsman's reputation. The guild maintained strict standards for workmanship and materials, appointing inspectors who examined finished goods and could impose fines or other penalties for substandard work. A master who consistently produced poor quality items could lose his guild membership and his right to practice as trader. Punishment that effectively meant social and economic ruin. The seasonal nature of much medieval work created complex patterns of labor and leisure. Carpenters were busiest during the warmer months when construction projects were feasible, but they also produced furniture, tools, and household goods throughout the year. The guild calendar included numerous religious holidays when work was forbidden, creating a rhythm of intense labor followed by periods of rest and celebration. International trade was transforming the medieval economy in ways that affected even local craftsmen. William might work with imported hardwoods from the Baltic regions, use steel tools manufactured in Milan, or create goods inspired by designs seen on items brought back by traveling merchants. The guild system initially resisted these changes, viewing foreign goods and techniques as threats to traditional practices, but gradually adapted to incorporate innovations that enhanced their members' competitiveness. The relationship between crafts and commerce was becoming increasingly complex as the medieval economy developed. Some guild masters like William remained focused on production, but others were expanding into retail trade, selling their goods directly to customers rather than through middlemen. Still, others were becoming entrepreneurs who employed large numbers of workers and coordinated complex manufacturing processes that resembled early industrial organization. The social status of skilled craftsmen was rising throughout this period, challenging traditional assumptions about social hierarchy. Masters who had achieved wealth and political influence demanded recognition that reflected their economic importance rather than their humble origins. Guild halls, elaborate guild ceremonies, and sumptuous clothing worn by guild officers all served to assert the dignity and importance of skilled craftsmanship in medieval society. This world of work was creating new forms of identity and social organization that would fundamentally reshape English society, laying the groundwork for the economic transformations of later centuries. The great bell of Canterbury Cathedral tolled across the city, calling the faithful to Lauds as the first light of dawn broke over the medieval townscape. For Thomas, Aldrich, Margaret, and their children, this sound marked not just the beginning of another day, but their place within the sacred rhythm that governed all aspects of medieval life. Religion in 14th century England was not a private matter confined to Sundays. It was the organizing principle that shaped work schedules, social relationships, economic transactions, and personal identity. The medieval calendar was fundamentally different from our modern secular year. Time was measured not by business quarters or school semesters, but by the liturgical cycle of feast days, fasting periods, and seasonal celebrations that marked Christianity's sacred narrative. For middle-class families like the old, This religious calendar created a complex pattern of work and leisure, expense and restraint, community celebration and personal devotion that defined their social and economic lives. The church bells that rang throughout each day were more than simple timekeepers. They were the heartbeat of medieval urban life. The canonical hours matins, Lauds prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline marked the progression of each day with prayers and services that oriented the entire community toward sacred time. Thomas might pause in his business negotiations when the bells called for terce at mid-morning, not from personal piety alone, but because doing business during prayer times was considered inappropriate and could harm his reputation with customers and partners. The medieval middle class experienced Christianity as both personal faith and social obligation. Regular church attendance was expected of respectable citizens. An absence from Sunday Mass without good reason invited questions about one's character and community standing. The Aldrich family occupied pews appropriate to their social status, not in the prestigious front rows reserved for nobility, but in respectable middle positions that reflected their economic standing and civic importance. Religious festivals punctuated the medieval year with celebrations that combined sacred observance with economic opportunity. The Feast of Corpus Christi in late spring brought elaborate processions through the streets, where guild members displayed their craftsmanship in decorative banners and ceremonial objects while demonstrating their piety and civic pride. Thomas and his fellow wool merchants might sponsor part of the procession, contributing money for candles, decorations, or performances that showcased both their prosperity and their devotion. The 12 days of Christmas represented the most important celebration of the medieval calendar, a period when normal work ceased and the entire social order participated in festivities that reinforced community bonds while temporarily inverting social hierarchies. Medieval Christmas celebrations were far removed from our modern commercial holidays. They were deeply religious observances that included special church services, charitable giving to the poor, and elaborate feasts that demonstrated hospitality and social status. During the Christmas season, the Aldrich household would expand to accommodate relatives, business partners, and dependents who expected hospitality from their prosperous host. Margaret would oversee the preparation of special foods, meat-spiced wines, elaborate pastries made with expensive imported ingredients that demonstrated the family's wealth while fulfilling their social obligations. The cost of these celebrations could be substantial, representing a significant portion of the family's annual expenses, but the social and business benefits made them essential investments. Easter was equally important but different in character, marking the end of Lent's 40-day period of fasting and restraint. The medieval middle class took these dietary restrictions seriously, both from religious conviction and social necessity. During Lent, the Aldrich family would eat no meat, restricting themselves to fish, vegetables, bread, and dairy products. This created significant challenges for household management. Margaret needed to plan menus that were nutritionally adequate, socially appropriate, and spiritually correct while working within the seasonal limitations of medieval food preservation. The business implications of the religious calendar were enormous. Major fairs and markets were timed to coincide with religious festivals. When people traveled for spiritual reasons and had money to spend on goods and entertainment, Thomas might plan his most important transactions around these events, timing shipments of wool to arrive when demand was highest and customers were most numerous. The Great Fair at Winchester during the Feast of St. Giles was a crucial event in his annual business cycle, requiring months of preparation and representing a substantial portion of his yearly income. Medieval pilgrimage represented another intersection of faith and commerce that shaped middle-class life. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral drew thousands of pilgrims annually, creating a thriving industry that supported innkeepers, food vendors, souvenir makers, and guides. Thomas Aldrich benefited indirectly from this pilgrim trade, as travelers needed clothing repaired, equipment replaced, and supplies purchased during their journeys. The Aldrich family participated in pilgrimage both as an expression of faith and as a form of medieval tourism. Margaret had travelled to the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham to pray for her children's health, combining religious devotion with a rare opportunity to travel beyond her daily routine. These journeys were significant expenses that required careful financial planning, but they also provided social prestige, spiritual benefits, and business networking opportunities. Medieval religious practice included numerous forms of charitable giving that were both spiritual obligations and social expectations. Successful merchants like Thomas were expected to contribute regularly to church construction projects, poor relief, and religious foundations. The guild maintained funds for members who fell on hard times, supported widows and orphans, and sponsored religious services for deceased members. These charitable activities created networks of mutual obligation that strengthened social bonds while demonstrating Christian virtue. The medieval understanding of work itself was deeply influenced by religious teaching. The Church taught that labor was a form of prayer and that honest craftsmanship reflected divine creativity. This theology gave dignity to manual work while establishing moral standards for business conduct. Charging excessive interest, using false weights and measures, or selling defective goods were not just bad business practices, but sins that endangered one's eternal salvation. Personal devotional practices varied considerably among middle-class families, reflecting both individual piety and social expectations. The Aldrich family owned several religious books, a Psalter, a Book of Hours for private prayer, and collections of saints' lives that provided moral instruction and entertainment. These manuscripts were valuable possessions that demonstrated literacy, devotion, and cultural sophistication. Margaret might spend an hour each morning in private prayer, reading from her Book of Hours and meditating on the spiritual lessons appropriate to each day's liturgical calendar. The physical environment of medieval towns reflected the centrality of religious faith in daily life. Churches dominated the skyline, their bells provided the only reliable timekeeping system, and religious imagery adorned public buildings, private homes, and commercial establishments. The Aldrich shop included a small shrine where Thomas would pray for business, success, and divine protection from the numerous hazards that threatened medieval merchants. Religious festivals also provided crucial social functions that strengthened community bonds across class lines. During major celebrations, normal social hierarchies were temporarily relaxed, allowing merchants, craftsmen, and laborers to participate together in communal activities. These shared experiences helped maintain social stability by providing outlets for tension while reinforcing shared values and beliefs. The medieval integration of faith and daily life created a worldview where spiritual and material concerns were inseparable, shaping every aspect of middle-class experience from birth to death. Asterisk. The acrid smell of burning herbs filled the solar as Margaret Aldrich tended to her youngest son, William, who had developed a fever during the night. In an age before antibiotics, vaccines, or even a basic understanding of disease transmission, illness was a constant threat that could destroy families and businesses with terrifying speed. The medieval middle class had more resources to combat disease than peasants, but they remained vulnerable to the same biological hazards that made life precarious. For everyone in the 14th century, medieval medicine was a complex blend of ancient learning, religious faith, practical experience, and dangerous superstition. University-trained physicians existed, but were extremely expensive and available only to the age nobility and wealthiest merchants. For middle-class families, like the Aldriches, healthcare was primarily the responsibility of women who combined traditional herbal knowledge with remedies learned from neighbors, traveling healers, and religious texts that offered spiritual as well as physical healing. Margaret's medical knowledge was typical of prosperous medieval housewives, extensive, practical, and potentially life-saving, but limited by the scientific understanding of her era. She maintained a garden of medicinal herbs behind their house, growing plants whose therapeutic properties had been discovered through centuries of trial and error. Willow bark for pain relief, chamomile for digestive problems, lavender for headaches and anxiety, and dozens of other species, whose active compounds would not be isolated and understood. For another 500 years, the medieval understanding of disease was based on the classical theory of the four phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were believed to govern both physical health and personality. According to this system, illness resulted from imbalances among these bodily fluids, which could be corrected through diet, herbal remedies, bloodletting, or purging. While this theory was fundamentally incorrect, it provided a coherent framework for understanding symptoms and selecting treatments that sometimes proved effective for reasons medieval practitioners could not have understood. Pregnancy and childbirth represented the greatest health risks faced by medieval women, with maternal mortality rates that would be shocking by modern standards. Margaret had given birth to 5 children, but lost 2 in infantia, common experience that shaped medieval attitudes toward family life and divine providence. During her pregnancies, she had relied on the services of a midwife, an older woman whose knowledge of obstetrics combined practical experience with religious rituals designed to invoke divine protection during the dangerous process of birth. Medieval midwifery was a respected profession that required considerable skill and knowledge. Experienced midwives understood which presentations were dangerous, how to assist with difficult births, and what herbal remedies might help with pain relief and infection prevention. They also performed important social functions, serving as confidential advisors to women on matters of sexuality, fertility, and family planning that could not be discussed openly in medieval society. The diet of middle-class families provided better nutrition than most people received, but nutritional deficiencies were still common due to seasonal variations in food availability and limited understanding of dietary requirements. The medieval emphasis on bread as the staff of life meant that grain quality directly affected public health. Goat poisoning from contaminated rye could cause hallucinations, seizures, and death, while deficiencies in vitamins that were not understood until the modern era led to diseases like scurvy and rickets. Dental health was surprisingly good among medieval people. largely due to diets that contained little refined sugar. However, tooth loss from injury, decay, or wear was common, and dental abscesses could be fatal in an era before effective pain relief or antibiotics. Barber surgeons provided basic dental care, extracting damaged teeth with primitive tools and no anesthesia beyond alcohol or herbal preparations. That provided minimal relief from excruciating pain. Mental health was understood primarily through religious rather than medical frameworks, with conditions we would recognize as depression, anxiety, or psychosis attributed to spiritual causes such as demonic possession, divine punishment, or insufficient faith. However, medieval society was often more tolerant of what we would call mental illness than later periods, viewing holy fools and eccentric behavior as potentially sacred rather than merely pathological. The medieval understanding of anatomy was limited by religious prohibitions against dissection of human bodies, which were considered sacred and destined for resurrection. Medical knowledge was based primarily on ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the works of Galen, whose anatomical descriptions were based on animal dissections and contained significant errors. This meant that even university-trained physicians had fundamentally incorrect understanding of basic bodily functions. Surgical procedures were extremely dangerous but not uncommon, performed by barber surgeons who combined medical practice with more mundane services like haircutting and shaving. These practitioners could set broken bones, treat wounds, remove bladder stones, and perform cataract surgery using techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated given their limitations. However, the lack of antiseptic procedures meant that infection was a constant threat, and many patients died from complications rather than their original conditions. The medieval middle class had access to a wider variety of medical treatments than poorer people, including imported drugs and spices that were believed to have therapeutic properties. Thomas Aldrich's shop might stock expensive medicines alongside his wool theriac, a complex compound believed to cure all poisons, Basora stones from the stomachs of animals thought to neutralize toxins, and exotic spices like cinnamon and ginger that were valued as much for their medicinal properties as their flavoring abilities. Public health measures were primitive but not entirely absent from medieval towns. Authorities understood that certain conditions promoted disease, leading to regulations about waste disposal, food quality, and water sources. Canterbury maintained public latrines, required butchers to dispose of animal waste outside the town walls, and appointed officials to inspect food sold in markets. However, the connection between poor sanitation and disease transmission was not understood, leading to practices that inadvertently promoted the spread of illness. The Black Death, which reached England in 1348, would fundamentally transform medieval attitudes toward health and mortality. This pandemic killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, devastating communities and destroying the social and economic structures that had defined medieval life. Middle-class families like the Aldriches were no more immune to plague than peasants, and their wealth offered little protection against a disease that medical science could neither understand nor treat. Medieval responses to epidemic disease combined practical measures with spiritual remedies. Communities might quarantine visitors from infected areas, flee to the countryside during outbreaks, or burn aromatic herbs to purify the air. However, religious responses were considered equally important. Public processions, increased charitable giving, and elaborate religious ceremonies designed to appease divine wrath and secure supernatural protection from disease. The constant presence of death in medieval life shaped attitudes toward health, aging, and medical care that differed significantly from modern perspectives. People expected to lose children to disease, anticipated shortened lifespans due to injury or illness, and viewed good health as a temporary blessing rather than a permanent condition. This fatalistic outlook coexisted with practical efforts to prevent and treat disease, creating a complex medical culture that combined resignation with determined efforts to preserve life and health. Personal hygiene practices among the medieval middle class were more sophisticated than popular stereotypes suggest, though limited by available technology and scientific understanding. Regular bathing was considered healthy and desirable, though full-body baths were time-consuming and expensive to prepare. Most people washed daily using basins of cold water, changed their linen undergarments regularly, and maintained dental hygiene using twigs, salt, and herbs. The integration of medical practice with religious belief created treatment approaches that addressed both physical and spiritual dimensions of illness, reflecting medieval assumptions about the interconnectedness of body and soul that would persist well into the modern era. The wooden stocks stood empty in Canterbury's Market Square on this particular morning, but their presence served as a constant reminder of the swift and often brutal justice that maintained order in medieval English towns. For the emerging middle class, law and order were essential conditions for their prosperity. Merchants needed predictable rules for contracts and trade. Craftsmen required protection for their property and workshops, and families sought security for their persons and possessions in an age when violence was an ever-present threat. Medieval justice operated on principles fundamentally different from modern legal systems. There was no police force as we understand it, no professional lawyers for ordinary citizens, and no presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Instead, medieval communities relied on a complex mixture of royal law, local customs, church courts, and guild regulations that created multiple overlapping jurisdictions where different types of cases might be heard by different authorities using different procedures. Thomas Aldrich, as a prosperous merchant, found himself involved in the medieval legal system from multiple perspectives. He served periodically as a juror in the town's monthly court sessions, where local disputes were resolved and minor crimes punished. His business activities required him to understand commercial law well enough to draft contracts, pursue debtors, and protect his interests in transactions that might take months or years to complete. And like all medieval townspeople, he lived with a constant awareness that accusations of wrongdoing could destroy his reputation, and medieval concepts of justice emphasized restoration and compensation rather than punishment alone, reflecting a worldview that saw crime as damage to social relationships that needed to be repaired rather than simply punished. The flickering candlelight illuminated the parchment contract spread across Thomas Aldrich's table as he and his wife Margaret discussed their daughter Eleanor's future. At 12 years old, Eleanor was approaching the age when marriage negotiations would begin, a process that would determine not only her personal happiness but also the family's social and economic prospects for generations to come. Medieval marriage among the middle class was a complex institution that blended romantic ideals with practical necessity, personal desire with family strategy, and individual choice with social expectations in ways that would seem both familiar and alien to modern observers. Marriage in 14th century England was simultaneously a personal relationship, a business partnership, an economic alliance, and a spiritual sacrament. For middle-class families like the old, choosing the right spouse for their children required careful consideration of multiple factors: the prospective partner's family reputation, economic prospects, social connections, personal character, and compatibility with existing family relationships. Love, while not entirely irrelevant, was considered less important than these practical considerations. Though medieval people hoped that affection would grow between spouses over time, the process of arranging Eleanor's marriage would begin several years before she actually wed, allowing time for careful investigation of potential partners and complex negotiations over financial arrangements. Thomas and Margaret would consider the sons of other merchant families, successful craftsmen who would establish their own workshops, or perhaps the younger son of a minor noble family whose social status might compensate for limited wealth. Each potential match would be evaluated, not just for its immediate benefits but for its long-term implications for the family's social position and economic security. Medieval courtship was a highly ritualized process governed by strict social conventions designed to protect family reputations, while allowing young people to become acquainted with their prospective spouses. Eleanor and her suitor would meet in supervised settings, perhaps at church services, family celebrations, or business gatherings where their parents could observe their interactions. Private meetings between unmarried young people were strongly discouraged and could lead to scandal that might destroy marriage prospects entirely. The legal aspects of medieval marriage were complex and varied according to social status and local customs. For the middle class, marriage typically involved formal contracts that specified the financial obligations of both families, including the bride's dowry, the groom's contribution to the household, and provisions for the wife's support if she became a widow. These contracts were serious business documents that could be enforced in court and often represented the largest financial transactions that middle-class families ever undertook. A dowry would likely consist of cash, household goods, and perhaps some property or business interests that would provide her with economic security and give her some influence within her married household. The size and composition of her dowry would significantly affect the type of husband she could attract. Wealthy merchant sons expected substantial dowries, while successful craftsmen might be satisfied with more modest contributions if the bride brought other advantages like business connections or domestic skills. The medieval understanding of marriage was shaped by Christian theology that viewed matrimony as a sacrament instituted by God for the procreation of children and the mutual support of spouses. This religious framework provided marriage with spiritual significance while establishing moral standards for conduct within the relationship. Adultery was both a sin and a legal offense that could be prosecuted in church courts, though enforcement varied considerably depending on social status and community attitudes. The wedding ceremony itself was an elaborate affair that demonstrated the family's social status while securing divine blessing for the new union. Medieval weddings began with a ceremony at the church door, where the couple exchanged vows in the presence of witnesses and received the priest's blessing. This was followed by a nuptial mass inside the church and then by celebrations that could last for days, depending on the family's wealth and social position. Wedding celebrations served important social functions beyond mere entertainment. They provided opportunities for families to display their prosperity, strengthen business relationships, and create networks of obligation that would be valuable in future dealings. The guest list was carefully planned to include customers, suppliers, guild members, and civic leaders whose attendance would enhance the family's social standing. The quality of food, entertainment, and gifts reflected directly on the host's success and generosity. Asterisk, asterisk. The economic implications of marriage extended far beyond the wedding expenses and dowry arrangements. For merchant families, marriage created business partnerships that could open new markets, provide access to capital, and establish valuable trade connections. A well-chosen spouse might bring expertise in different aspects of commerce, connections to suppliers or customers in distant locations, or skills that complemented the family's existing activities. The daily reality of medieval marriage varied enormously depending on the personalities, circumstances, and expectations of the individuals involved. Some couples developed deep affection and partnership over time, working together to build successful businesses and raise children in an atmosphere of mutual respect and cooperation. Others maintained cordial but distant relationships, fulfilling their social and economic obligations without achieving true intimacy or emotional connection. Women's roles within medieval marriage were legally subordinate but practically complex. Wives like Margaret Aldrich had no independent legal status and could not own property or make contracts without their husband's consent. However, the practical demands of running a medieval household and business often required women to exercise considerable authority and decision-making power. Successful merchants frequently relied heavily on their wives' skills in managing domestic affairs, maintaining social relationships, and even participating directly in business activities. The medieval concept of romantic love was developing during this period, influenced by courtly literature and troubadour poetry that celebrated passionate attachment between men and women. However, this idealized love was typically portrayed as occurring outside of marriage, between knights and noble ladies whose relationships were supposedly spiritual rather than physical. For the middle class, romantic ideals were slowly beginning to influence expectations about marriage, though practical considerations remained paramount. Medieval marriage was expected to produce children quickly, both to ensure family continuity and to provide economic security for aging parents. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous for medieval women, and infant mortality rates were high, meaning that families needed multiple children to ensure that some would survive to adulthood. The loss of children was a common sorrow that shaped medieval attitudes toward family life and divine providence. Child-rearing practices reflected the social and economic realities of medieval life. Children were viewed as small adults who needed to learn practical skills and social expectations as quickly as possible. Boys like John Aldrich began learning their father's trade as soon as they could perform simple tasks, while girls like Eleanor mastered domestic skills that would be essential for managing their own households. Education beyond basic literacy and numeracy was a luxury that few families could afford. Though successful merchants increasingly recognized its value for their children's future, prospects. The relationship between parents and children was more formal than modern family dynamics, with emphasis on respect, obedience, and fulfillment of family obligations, rather than emotional intimacy or individual self-expression. However, medieval parents clearly loved their children and made significant sacrifices to ensure their welfare and future success. The letters and wills that survive from this period reveal deep parental concern for children's spiritual and material well-being. Marriage dissolution was extremely difficult in medieval society. requiring ecclesiastical court proceedings that were expensive, time-consuming, and publicly embarrassing. Annulment was possible in cases where the original marriage was invalid due to close kinship, previous marriage contracts, or lack of proper consent, but divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Separated spouses could not remarry, making failed marriages permanent sources of legal and social complications. The medieval middle class family was an economic unit as much as an emotional one, with success depending on the cooperation and complementary skills of all its members in pursuit of shared goals of prosperity and social advancement. Asterisk. The scratching of quill pens on parchment filled the small chamber above Master Geoffrey's bakery, where 8 boys bent over their lessons in the dim morning light. Among them sat John Aldrich, Thomas's 14-year-old son, carefully copying Latin verses, while mentally calculating the price of wheat and the profit margins on different types of bread. This scene, repeated in countless towns across medieval England, represented one of the most significant social transformations of the era. The gradual spread of literacy and formal education beyond the clergy and nobility to the emerging merchant class. Education in medieval England was not a universal right or expectation, as it would become in later centuries, but a luxury that required careful financial planning and clear social purpose. For families like the Aldriches, investing in their children's education was both an expression of their rising social status and a practical necessity for maintaining their commercial success. The ability to read, write, and calculate was becoming increasingly valuable in an economy that depended on complex contracts, international correspondence, and sophisticated accounting practices. The medieval educational system was a patchwork of institutions that had evolved to serve different social needs and religious purposes. Cathedral schools, originally established to train clergy, were gradually opening their doors to lay students whose families could afford the fees. Grammar schools in larger towns provided basic instruction in Latin, arithmetic, and religious doctrine. Private tutors served wealthy families who preferred individual instruction for their children, and guild schools taught the specialized knowledge needed for particular trades and crafts. John Aldrich's education began at home, where his mother Margaret taught him to recognize letters and numbers using religious texts and commercial documents. This early instruction was crucial because formal schooling assumed basic literacy, and children who arrived at school unable to read simple words quickly fell behind their classmates. Medieval mothers were often more literate than historical stereotypes suggest, particularly in merchant families where women needed to manage complex household accounts and correspondence. The curriculum at Master Geoffrey's school reflected the medieval hierarchy of knowledge, which placed religious learning at the apex, followed by classical literature and philosophy, with practical subjects like arithmetic and vernacular languages receiving less emphasis. John began each day with prayers and readings from religious texts, moved on to Latin grammar and vocabulary, and concluded with arithmetic lessons that used commercial problems to teach mathematical concepts. This blend of sacred and secular knowledge was characteristic of medieval education, which sought to produce both good Christians and competent citizens. Latin was the universal language of educated discourse in medieval Europe, essential for anyone hoping to participate in international commerce, legal proceedings, or scholarly activities. John struggled with Latin grammar and syntax, finding it difficult to master a language he never heard spoken in daily conversation. However, his teachers emphasized that Latin literacy was what separated educated people from the common masses, and that success in business increasingly required the ability to read contracts written in Latin and correspond with merchants from other countries. Medieval textbooks were handwritten manuscripts that were expensive and scarce, requiring students to memorize vast amounts of material rather than relying on written references. John owned a basic primer that contained the alphabet, common prayers, and simple Latin texts, but most of his learning came through oral instruction and repetition. Teachers used various mnemonic devices and singing to help students memorize information, creating an educational atmosphere that was more musical and rhythmic than modern classrooms. The teaching methods employed in medieval schools would seem harsh by contemporary standards, with frequent use of physical punishment to encourage learning and maintain discipline. Master Geoffrey carried a birch rod that he used liberally on students who failed to complete their lessons or showed disrespect for authority. However, this physical discipline was considered necessary and beneficial, reflecting medieval beliefs about the inherently sinful nature of children and the need for strict guidance to develop proper character. Mathematical education in medieval schools was limited but practical, focusing on the arithmetic skills needed for commerce rather than abstract mathematical concepts. John learned to add, subtract, multiply, and divide using Roman numerals, which made calculations difficult and time-consuming. The introduction of Arabic numerals and algebraic methods was gradually occurring during this period, but traditional educators resisted these innovations as foreign and potentially dangerous to Christian culture. The social dynamics of medieval schools reflected the broader hierarchies of medieval society, with students from different social backgrounds receiving different types of instruction and treatment. Sons of merchants like John were expected to learn practical skills that would help them in business, while boys from noble families focused more heavily on classical literature and military training. However, the shared experience of formal education created bonds between students that could prove valuable in later commercial and political relationships. Medieval universities were beginning to emerge as centers of advanced learning, though they remained primarily focused on training clergy, lawyers, and physicians rather than merchants or craftsmen. The University of Oxford, founded in the 12th century, was attracting students from across England and Europe who sought advanced instruction in theology, law, and natural philosophy. However, university education was extremely expensive and time-consuming, requiring years of study that few merchant families could afford to support. For girls like Eleanor Aldrich, educational opportunities were much more limited, reflecting medieval assumptions about women's roles and capabilities. Eleanor received basic instruction in reading and writing from her mother and a local priest, but her education focused primarily on domestic skills, cooking, sewing, household management, and the social graces necessary for entertaining guests and maintaining family relationships. However, some merchant daughters received more extensive education, particularly if they were expected to participate directly in family businesses. The medieval attitude toward books and learning was profoundly different from modern perspectives, shaped by the scarcity and expense of written materials. Books were precious objects that were often chained to desks to prevent theft, carefully maintained and repaired when damaged, and passed down through generations as valuable family heirlooms. The process of creating books was slow and labor-intensive, requiring skilled scribes who could write clearly and accurately, illuminators who decorated pages with intricate designs, and bookbinders who assembled the finished volumes. Private libraries were extremely rare and small, consisting primarily of religious texts, classical works, and practical manuals related to specific trades or professions. Thomas Aldrich owned perhaps a dozen books, a substantial collection for a merchant, including a psalter for daily prayers, a book of hours for private devotions, a collection of commercial forms and legal precedents, and several chronicles that provided entertainment as well as moral instruction. The spread of literacy among the medieval middle class was creating new forms of social and political awareness, as literate merchants could read government proclamations, legal documents, and news from distant places without relying on oral reports that might be inaccurate or biased. This growing literacy was gradually undermining the traditional monopoly on information held by clergy and nobility, contributing to social changes that would accelerate in later centuries. Medieval education also included significant amounts of moral and religious instruction designed to produce not just competent workers but good Christians who would contribute to social stability and spiritual welfare of their communities. Students memorized biblical passages, learned about the lives of saints, and received detailed instruction about Christian doctrine and proper behavior. This religious education was considered as important as practical skills, reflecting medieval beliefs about the interconnectedness of spiritual and material success. The apprenticeship system provided an alternative form of education that was more directly practical than formal schooling. Young men who were destined for particular trades would be bound to master craftsmen who taught them technical skills through hands-on experience rather than book learning. This system produced highly skilled artisans who understood their crafts intimately, though they might lack the broader intellectual development that formal education provided. Medieval attitudes toward knowledge emphasized authority and tradition rather than innovation and original thinking. Students were expected to master existing knowledge rather than question or challenge it. An educational success was measured by accuracy in reproducing established truths rather than creativity or independent analysis. However, this conservative approach to learning was beginning to change during the 14th century, as contact with Islamic and Byzantine scholarship introduced new ideas and methods that would eventually transform European intellectual life. That medieval pursuit of knowledge was intimately connected with religious faith, as educated people sought to understand God's creation rather than simply manipulate natural phenomena for practical purposes. This theological framework gave learning a spiritual dimension that motivated serious study while establishing boundaries beyond which inquiry was considered dangerous or heretical. Asterisk. The muddy roads leading out of Canterbury stretched toward horizons that held both opportunity and danger for medieval merchants like Thomas Aldrich. In an age before maps were common, weather forecasting existed, or reliable transportation networks connected distant cities, undertaking a business journey was an act of faith that required careful preparation, considerable courage, and acceptance of risks that could destroy fortunes or end lives. Yet the profits to be made from land trade were so substantial that merchants regularly embarked on expeditions that might take them hundreds of miles from home and keep them away for months at a time. Medieval travel was fundamentally different from modern mobility, slower, more dangerous, and far more expensive relative to most people's incomes. The typical merchant's journey proceeded at the pace of walking horses or ox-drawn carts, covering perhaps 20 to 30 miles per day under good conditions. Bad weather, muddy roads, mechanical breakdowns, or security concerns could reduce this to a crawl. making even relatively short trips lengthy ordeals that tested both physical endurance and mental resilience. That the roads themselves were a constant challenge that shaped every aspect of medieval commerce. Most were little more than dirt tracks that became impassable during heavy rains, turning simple journeys into adventures that required constant route adjustments and careful timing. The famous Roman roads still provided the backbone of England's transportation network, but centuries of neglect had left many in poor condition, with broken surfaces, collapsed bridges, and inadequate drainage that created hazardous traveling conditions. Thomas Aldrich typically made 2 major trading expeditions each year, one to London in the spring to purchase imported goods and arrange financing for his seasonal operations, and another to the Great Autumn Fair at Winchester to sell his accumulated wool stocks and purchase luxury items for the Christmas season. These journeys required weeks of preparation, careful coordination with other merchants for mutual protection, and detailed planning for every aspect of the trip, from route selection to accommodation arrangements. Preparation for a medieval trading expedition resembled planning for a military campaign, requiring attention to logistics, security, and contingency planning that would impress modern business travelers. Thomas needed to arrange for carts and pack animals, hire guards and drivers, prepare documents proving ownership of his goods, secure letters of credit from money changers, and make arrangements for his family and business to function during his absence. The costs of these preparations were substantial, representing significant financial risks that had to be balanced against expected profits. Medieval merchants traveled in groups whenever possible, forming trading caravans that provided mutual protection against the bandits, wild animals, and hostile local populations that threatened individual travelers. These merchant consortiums were temporary partnerships that shared costs and risks while providing companionship during long, lonely journeys. The social dynamics of these traveling groups were complex, as merchants who were competitors in normal circumstances had to cooperate closely while remaining alert for opportunities to gain advantages over their temporary allies. The accommodation available to medieval travelers ranged from comfortable inns in major cities to primitive shelters in rural areas where merchants might sleep on straw in barn lofts or around tavern hearths. The better establishments provided not just beds and meals, but also secure storage for valuable goods, care for horses and pack animals, and information about road conditions and local political situations that could affect travel plans. Innkeeping was a profitable business that served the growing merchant class while creating employment for local populations. Medieval maps were works of art rather than practical navigation aids, combining geographical information with religious symbolism and classical mythology in ways that were more inspirational than useful for actual travel. Most merchants relied on local knowledge, hired guides, and detailed written directions that specified landmarks, distances between towns, and reliable stopping places. This dependence on local expertise made merchants vulnerable to guides who might lead them astray for personal gain or political reasons. The monetary systems encountered during medieval travel were bewilderingly complex, with different regions using different currencies, weights, and measures that required constant calculation and conversion. Thomas needed to understand the relative values of English pennies, Flemish groats, French livres, and Italian florins, while also dealing with local variations in coin, purity, and exchange rates that fluctuated based on political conditions and seasonal trade patterns. Mistakes in currency conversion could quickly eliminate the profits from entire trading expeditions. International trade was creating cultural exchanges that were transforming medieval English society in subtle but significant ways. Merchants like Thomas returned from their journeys with more than just exotic goods. They brought new ideas about business practices, different approaches to craftsmanship, alternative methods of food preparation, and exposure to different ways of organizing social and economic life. These cultural influences gradually spread through medieval society, contributing to changes that would accelerate during the Renaissance. The great medieval fairs were international events that attracted merchants from across Europe and beyond, creating temporary cities where thousands of people conducted business worth enormous sums of money. The fair at Champagne in France was perhaps the most famous, but English fairs at Winchester, Stourbridge, and Boston were also significant events that shaped the rhythm of medieval commercial life. These gatherings provided opportunities not just for buying and selling goods, but for arranging credit, negotiating partnerships, and gathering information about market conditions in distant regions. The logistics of participating in major fairs were staggering, requiring months of advanced planning and coordination between merchants, local authorities, and international trading networks. Fair organizers provided security, established standard weights and measures, set up courts for resolving commercial disputes, and arranged for the money-changing services that were essential for international commerce. The temporary nature of these events created intense periods of activity followed by months of relative quiet that shaped the seasonal rhythms of medieval business. Medieval merchants were among the first international travelers, developing networks of contacts and relationships that spanned continental boundaries and cultural differences. Thomas Aldrich might correspond regularly with wool buyers in Flanders, spice dealers in Venice, and wine merchants in Bordeaux, maintaining business relationships that depended on mutual trust and shared commercial interests despite differences in language, religion, and political allegiance. The hazards of medieval travel extended beyond physical dangers to include legal and political complications that could strand merchants in foreign territories or result in the confiscation of their goods. Wars between kingdoms could suddenly make peaceful merchants into enemy aliens, while changes in local regulations could make previously legal activities subject to prosecution. Successful medieval merchants needed to be amateur diplomats who could navigate complex political situations while protecting their commercial interests. Sea travel offered faster transportation for some goods, but involved even greater risks than overland journeys. Medieval ships were small, primitive by later standards, and vulnerable to storms, pirates, and mechanical failures that could destroy entire cargoes. However, the profits from successful maritime trading ventures were so substantial that merchants regularly invested in shipping. Despite the enormous risks involved, the medieval world was far more interconnected than popular stereotypes suggest, with trading networks that linked England to destinations as distant as Constantinople, Alexandria, and even India. English wool might be processed in Flemish cities, woven into cloth that was dyed with materials from the Mediterranean, and sold in markets that served customers from across the known world. These international connections were creating a global economy that would become increasingly important in later centuries. Medieval merchants were agents of change who carried new technologies, ideas, and cultural practices between different regions and societies. The double-entry bookkeeping system developed in Italian cities, improved methods of metalworking discovered in Germanic regions, and agricultural techniques perfected in various climates all spread through Europe via the trading networks maintained by traveling merchants. The personal transformation experienced by medieval merchants during their travels was often as significant as the commercial results of their expeditions. Exposure to different cultures, languages, and ways of life broadened their perspectives and challenged provincial assumptions about how society should be organized. These cosmopolitan merchants became advocates for change within their own communities, contributing to the social and economic developments that would eventually transform medieval England into a more modern society. The tolling of Canterbury Cathedral's bells on Michaelmas morning, September 29th, marked more than just another saint's day in the medieval calendar. For Thomas Aldrich and his fellow merchants, this feast day represented the beginning of the most crucial season in their annual business cycle. When accounts were settled, rents came due, and the year's profits were finally calculated. Medieval life moved to rhythms fundamentally different from our modern schedules, governed by agricultural seasons, religious observances, and trading cycles that created a calendar rich with meaning, celebration, and economic significance. The medieval understanding of time itself differed profoundly from contemporary perspectives. Without mechanical clocks, precise scheduling was impossible, and daily activities were organized around natural phenomena, sunrise and sunset, seasonal changes, and the cycle of agricultural work that determined when goods were available and when people had money to spend. Church bells provided the only reliable time signals, marking the canonical hours that divided each day into periods of prayer, work, and rest. Winter was the quiet season for most medieval businesses, when harsh weather made travel dangerous and agricultural work largely ceased. For the Aldrich family, these months were devoted to indoor activities, repairing tools and equipment, maintaining buildings, processing accumulated paperwork, and planning for the coming year's activities. Margaret used this time for major household tasks like spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth for family clothing, and preserving foods that would sustain the household through the lean months before spring harvests. The medieval winter diet was monotonous but carefully planned to provide adequate nutrition during the months when fresh foods were unavailable. Stored grains, preserved meats, pickled vegetables, and dried fruits formed the basis of most meals, supplemented by whatever fresh game, dairy products, or greenhouse herbs might be available. The Aldrich family's prosperity allowed them to purchase imported spices, preserved fish, and other delicacies that added variety to winter meals. But even wealthy families faced dietary limitations that shaped their health and social activities. Christmas represented the most elaborate celebration of the medieval year, a 12-day festival that combined religious observance with social obligations and business opportunities. The Aldrich household prepared for weeks in advance, accumulating special foods, brewing extra ale and wine, and purchasing gifts for family members, servants, and important business associates. The cost of Christmas celebrations could be enormous, equivalent to several months of normal household expenses, but the social and business benefits made these investments essential for maintaining family status and commercial relationships. Medieval Christmas celebrations bore little resemblance to modern holiday traditions, focusing on religious services, charitable giving, and elaborate feasts that demonstrated hospitality and prosperity. The Aldrich family would attend multiple church services, participate in community processions, and host dinners for relatives, business partners, and employees. These gatherings served important social functions, strengthening relationships that were crucial for business success, while fulfilling religious obligations to care for the poor and disadvantaged. The new year began not in January but on Lady Day, March 25th, when medieval people believed the world was created and Christ was conceived. This spring beginning made practical sense in an agricultural economy where the growing season determined economic activity. For merchants like Thomas, Lady Day marked the start of the active trading season when roads became passable, ships could sail safely, and customers had money from selling their agricultural products. Easter was the most important religious celebration of the medieval calendar, preceded by the 40-day Lenten fast that significantly affected economic activity. During Lent, consumption of meat, dairy products, and other luxury foods was forbidden, creating opportunities for merchants who dealt in fish, vegetables, and other permitted foods, while reducing demand for expensive imported delicacies. The Aldrich family took these dietary restrictions seriously, both from religious conviction and social necessity. Failure to observe Lenten fasting properly could damage their reputation and business relationships. The agricultural calendar created seasonal patterns of demand that shaped medieval business cycles in ways that modern commercial activity cannot fully capture. Spring brought renewed activity as farmers purchased tools, seeds, and equipment needed for planting. Summer was the season for major construction projects when weather-permitted outdoor work and materials were readily available. Autumn was the time for major fairs and markets when harvest proceeds gave rural populations money to spend on manufactured goods. Medieval people understood their relationship with nature in ways that industrial societies have largely forgotten, recognizing their dependence on weather patterns, seasonal cycles, and natural phenomena that determined the success or failure of their economic activities. A late spring could delay planting and reduce agricultural yields, affecting not just farmers but the entire network of merchants, craftsmen, and service providers who depended on agricultural prosperity. The feast days of various saints provided regular breaks from work while creating opportunities for specialized commercial activities. St. Crispin's Day, October 25th, was celebrated by shoemakers and leather workers, who might organize special markets and exhibitions of their finest products. St. Eligius, December 1st, was honored by metal workers and goldsmiths, whose celebrations included demonstrations of their skills and competitions between different workshops. Medieval festivals served crucial social functions beyond their religious significance, providing outlets for community tensions while reinforcing shared values and social hierarchies. During certain celebrations, normal social rules were temporarily suspended, allowing servants to mock their masters, peasants to parody nobility, and women to assume male roles in ritualized reversals that relieved social pressures, while ultimately confirming the existing order. The Feast of Fools, typically held around New Year's Day, exemplified these temporary inversions of social hierarchy. During this celebration, the lowest-ranking members of cathedral chapters would elect a mock bishop who would parody religious services, while the congregation engaged in behavior that would be scandalous at other times. For merchants like Thomas, these festivals provided valuable insights into popular attitudes while offering opportunities to demonstrate their generosity through charitable giving and public entertainment. Day celebrations marked the renewal of life and fertility, with rituals that combined Christian symbolism with older pagan traditions. Young people would gather flowers and greenery to decorate their homes and churches, dance around maypoles erected in town squares, and participate in contests and games that strengthened community bonds. For the medieval middle class, May Day was both a religious observance and a business opportunity, as celebrants purchased ribbons, flowers, food, and drink for their festivities. The medieval summer was punctuated by numerous local festivals that reflected the agricultural cycle and regional traditions. Harvest festivals in late summer and early autumn celebrated the gathering of crops while providing opportunities for communities to assess their economic prospects for the coming year. These celebrations combined Thanksgiving services with markets, entertainment, and social gatherings that strengthened the networks of relationships essential for medieval commerce. Medieval people's relationship with death was fundamentally different from modern attitudes, shaped by high mortality rates and religious beliefs about the afterlife that made death a constant presence in daily life. All Souls' Day, November 2nd, was devoted to prayers for the dead, with families visiting graves, lighting candles, and making charitable contributions intended to help departed relatives escape purgatory. For the Aldrich family, this involved significant expenses for special masses, charitable donations, and memorial offerings that demonstrated both their piety and their prosperity. The medieval calendar included numerous fast days and periods of dietary restriction that significantly affected commercial activity. Fish merchants prospered during Lent and on the weekly fast days observed throughout the year, while butchers and dairy vendors faced reduced demand for their products. Successful medieval merchants learned to anticipate these patterns, adjusting their inventory and pricing strategies to profit from religiously mandated changes in consumption patterns. Weather played a far more crucial role in medieval life than in our climate-controlled modern world, with seasonal variations affecting everything from food availability to travel conditions to the heating costs that consumed substantial portions of household budgets. The Aldrich family's annual cycle was shaped by their need to accumulate fuel for winter heating, preserve foods before they spoiled, and coordinate business activities with weather patterns that determined when roads were passable and ships could sail safely. Medieval record-keeping reflected the religious organization of time, with business documents dated according to feast days rather than numbered calendar days. A contract might be dated the Feast of St. Michael, rather than September 29th, requiring merchants to maintain detailed knowledge of the liturgical calendar. This system created a temporal framework that integrated commercial activity with religious observance in ways that reinforced the sacred character of daily life. The medieval understanding of seasonal health patterns influenced both personal behavior and commercial activity. Spring was considered the best time for bloodletting and other medical treatments. Summer was thought to promote certain diseases while curing others, and winter was associated with melancholy and respiratory ailments. Merchants who dealt in medicinal herbs and preparations adjusted their inventory according to these seasonal health beliefs. Regional variations in calendar observances created both challenges and opportunities. For traveling merchants, different areas celebrated different saints' days, observed varying degrees of dietary restriction during penitential seasons, and maintained local customs that could affect business activities. Successful merchants learned to adapt their practices to local calendars, timing their arrival in different markets to coincide with favorable celebrations while avoiding periods when business would be restricted. The medieval agricultural year created patterns of debt and credit that shaped commercial relationships throughout society. Farmers typically borrowed money in spring to purchase seeds and equipment, repaying these loans after harvest. Urban merchants extended credit to rural customers while arranging their own financing to cover the gap between expenses and income. These credit cycles created complex financial relationships that required careful management of cash flow and risk. Assessment. Medieval seasonal celebrations often involved significant gambling and games of chance that reflected attitudes toward fortune and divine providence. During major festivals, people would wager on dice games, wrestling matches, and other contests that combined entertainment with the possibility of financial gain or loss. For merchant families, these activities provided relaxation and social networking opportunities while demonstrating their prosperity and willingness to take calculated risks. The preparation required for major medieval celebrations was enormous, involving weeks or months of advanced planning, significant financial investment, and coordination between multiple households and institutions. The Aldrich family's Christmas preparations began in autumn with the purchase of special foods and gifts, continued through December with brewing, baking, and decorating activities, and culminated in 12 days of elaborate entertaining that exhausted both financial resources and physical energy. Medieval seasonal variations in daylight hours were far more significant than modern electric lighting allows us to appreciate. Winter days were short and dark, limiting the hours available for productive work while increasing expenses for artificial lighting. Summer's long daylight hours allowed extended workdays but also created health challenges in an era before effective methods of cooling and ventilation. The medieval calendar created rhythms of anticipation and celebration that gave meaning and structure to annual cycles of work and rest. These patterns helped medieval people cope with the uncertainties and hardships of their era while providing frameworks for social cooperation and economic planning that enabled their communities to prosper despite the challenges they faced. Asterisk. The parchment deed in Thomas Aldrich's strongbox represented more than just property ownership, symbolized a social transformation that would have been unimaginable to his grandfather, a simple shepherd who had never owned anything more valuable than his wool-gathering tools. By 1347, Thomas possessed not only his own shop and dwelling, but also to smaller properties that he rented to other tradesmen, a partnership in a wool processing mill outside Canterbury, and enough liquid capital to make substantial loans to fellow merchants and even minor nobles who found themselves temporarily short of funds. The rise of families like the Aldriches challenged medieval Europe's traditional social structure in ways that would eventually reshape the entire continent. The rigid three-estate system that divided society into those who fought nobility, those who prayed clergy, and those who worked everyone else was being complicated by the emergence of a merchant class whose wealth rivaled that of minor nobles but whose social status remained ambiguous and contested. Social mobility in medieval England was far more common than popular stereotypes suggest, though it typically occurred gradually over several generations rather than through dramatic individual success stories. Thomas's family exemplified this pattern. His grandfather had been a rural shepherd who learned to read and write. His father had become a wool factor who dealt with urban merchants. And Thomas himself had established an independent business that elevated his family into the ranks of the urban elite. The mechanisms of medieval social advancement were complex and varied, involving not just the accumulation of wealth, but the careful cultivation of relationships, the demonstration of civic virtue, and the adoption of behavioral patterns that signaled respectability and reliability. Successful merchants needed to master the subtle codes of dress, speech, and conduct that marked them as worthy of trust and social recognition, while avoiding displays of wealth that might provoke resentment or legal restrictions. Guild membership provided one of the most important pathways to social advancement for medieval craftsmen and merchants. Achieving the rank of master craftsman or guild officer carried social prestige that extended far beyond economic benefits, conferring the right to participate in municipal governance and establishing relationships with other guild masters that could lead to marriage alliances and business partnerships. The guild system created meritocratic elements within medieval society that allowed talented individuals to rise based on their skills and dedication. Education was becoming increasingly important as a marker of social status and a tool for advancement. Literacy distinguished the middle class from the masses of illiterate peasants and laborers while providing practical advantages in business dealings that required complex contracts and international correspondence. Families like the Aldriches invested heavily in their children's education, recognizing that reading, writing, and arithmetic skills would be essential for maintaining their social position. The medieval church provided another avenue for social advancement, particularly for younger sons who could not inherit family businesses or properties. Clerical careers offered opportunities for education, travel, and contact with powerful patrons that could lead to significant advancement. Some bishops and abbots wielded more political influence than many secular nobles, and successful ecclesiastical careers could elevate entire families through the wealth and connections they provided. Marriage strategies were crucial for maintaining and improving social position, with medieval families carefully selecting spouses who would enhance their economic prospects and social standing. The Aldrich family's marriage negotiations would consider not just the immediate benefits of particular alliances, but their long-term implications for family status and business opportunities. Successful marriages could open new markets, provide access to capital, and establish valuable political connections. The accumulation of land remained the most secure foundation for social advancement, as property ownership provided both economic security and social prestige. Medieval merchants like Thomas used their commercial profits to purchase real estate, both for the rental income it provided and for the social status that land ownership conferred. The transition from merchant to landowner marked a crucial step in the process of social advancement that could establish a family among the rural gentry. Military service offered opportunities for advancement that were particularly attractive to ambitious young men from merchant families. The increasing use of paid professional soldiers rather than feudal levies created openings for capable individuals to rise through military ranks based on merit rather than birth. Success in warfare could lead to knighthood, land grants, and noble status that would elevate entire families. The expansion of royal bureaucracy during this period created new types of careers that combined administrative skills with social advancement. Literate merchants' sons could find employment as clerks, tax collectors, or legal officials whose positions provided steady incomes and opportunities for corruption that could lead to significant wealth accumulation. These bureaucratic careers offered social respectability while avoiding the risks associated with commercial ventures. Medieval concepts of nobility were gradually evolving to accommodate the reality of wealthy merchants, whose economic power could not be ignored. The distinction between old money based on land, ownership, and military service, and new money derived from commerce, was becoming less rigid, though tensions between established nobility and rising merchants would persist for centuries. The legal system was adapting to recognize the changing social realities created by commercial development. New laws governing contracts, partnerships, and corporate organizations reflected the needs of an increasingly complex economy while providing legal frameworks that protected merchant interests. These legal changes both facilitated social mobility and provided mechanisms for regulating the behavior of newly wealthy merchants. Urban development was creating new forms of social organization that differed significantly from rural feudal structures. Medieval towns were becoming centers of innovation where traditional social hierarchies were challenged by economic realities, and where new forms of governance emerged to manage increasingly complex communities. Successful merchants could achieve positions of political leadership that would have been impossible under purely feudal arrangements. The medieval middle class was developing distinctive cultural characteristics that set them apart from both the nobility above and the peasantry below. Their homes, clothing, food, and entertainment reflected their unique position in society, while demonstrating their economic success and social aspirations. This emerging middle-class culture would eventually influence broader social developments throughout Europe. International trade was exposing medieval merchants to different social systems and cultural practices that challenged traditional assumptions about social organization. Contact with Italian city-states, Flemish commercial centers, and other advanced trading societies provided examples of alternative approaches to governance and social stratification that influenced English developments. The Black Death, which would reach England within a year of our story, would dramatically accelerate these processes of social change by disrupting traditional economic relationships and creating new opportunities for advancement. The massive population losses caused by plague would break down many social barriers while creating labor shortages that would enhance the bargaining power of surviving workers and merchants. The transformation of medieval English society was creating both opportunities and anxieties for families like the Aldriches. While their economic success provided unprecedented possibilities for social advancement, it also exposed them to new forms of risk and social criticism. Traditional elites resented their growing influence, while common people might view their prosperity with suspicion or envy. The medieval world was experiencing changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the emergence of modern capitalism. Families like the Aldriches were not just beneficiaries of these transformations, but active agents in creating the social and economic conditions that would reshape European civilization. Their daily struggles to balance tradition with innovation, security with opportunity, and individual advancement with social responsibility were helping to forge a new world whose implications they could barely imagine. As the candles flickered low in the Aldrich solar on that December evening in 1347, Thomas reviewed the accounts that recorded not just his family's financial position, but their place in a social transformation that was quietly revolutionizing medieval England. The neat columns of income and expenses, the careful records of debts and credits, and the detailed inventories of goods and property represented more than mere bookkeeping. They documented the emergence of economic and social systems that would eventually evolve into the foundations of modern Western civilization. The medieval middle class that families like the Aldriches represented was creating new forms of economic organization that would prove more durable and influential than the feudal structures they gradually replaced. Their emphasis on contractual relationships rather than personal loyalty, their development of sophisticated credit and banking systems, and their creation of international trading networks, established patterns of commercial activity that remain recognizable in contemporary business practices. The guild system that governed medieval crafts and trades was developing concepts of professional standards, quality control, and collective bargaining that would influence labor organization for centuries to come. The apprenticeship programs that trained skilled workers, the mutual aid societies that protected members against economic hardship, and the political organizations that represented craftsmen's interests in municipal governance created precedents for modern professional associations and labor unions. Medieval merchants were pioneering accounting methods and business practices that would become standard throughout the commercial world. The double-entry bookkeeping systems developed in Italian cities, the letters of credit that facilitated international trade, and the partnership agreements that shared risks and profits across multiple investors established financial innovations that would prove essential for economic development in later centuries. The social mobility that characterized medieval merchant society was creating new concepts of individual achievement and social advancement based on merit rather than birth. While medieval social hierarchies remained rigid in many ways, the success of families like the Aldriches demonstrated that economic talent and hard work could overcome the disadvantages of humble origins, establishing precedents for the meritocratic ideals that would become central to modern democratic societies. The medieval middle class was developing distinctive cultural values that emphasized education, civic responsibility, and family advancement through legitimate economic activity. Their investment in their children's schooling, their participation in municipal governance, and their commitment to building businesses that would provide security for future generations reflected attitudes toward progress and social improvement that would characterize middle-class culture for centuries. The urban civilization that emerged around medieval commercial centers was creating new forms of social organization that differed fundamentally from rural feudal structures. Medieval towns were becoming laboratories for democratic governance, where elected officials made decisions based on majority opinion rather than aristocratic privilege, and where complex legal systems developed to regulate increasingly sophisticated economic relationships. Medieval merchants were inadvertently laying the groundwork for the scientific and intellectual developments that would characterize the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Their international trading networks exposed European society to new ideas and technologies from other cultures, while their practical needs for navigation, accounting, and quality control created demands for mathematical and scientific knowledge that would drive educational and intellectual progress. The medieval integration of religious faith with commercial activity was establishing patterns of ethical business conduct that would influence Western economic culture long after religious belief lost its central role in public life. The medieval emphasis on fair pricing, honest dealing, and social responsibility created moral frameworks for commercial activity that would evolve into modern concepts of business, ethics, and corporate social responsibility. The family structures developed by medieval merchants were creating new models for domestic organization that balanced economic cooperation with emotional relationships. The medieval merchant household, which combined family life with business activity, established patterns of gender roles, child rearing, and intergenerational cooperation that would influence family development throughout the Western world. Medieval women's participation in commercial activities was creating precedents for female economic independence that would eventually challenge traditional assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. While medieval women faced significant legal and social restrictions, successful merchant wives and widows demonstrated that women could manage complex businesses and participate effectively in economic activities previously reserved for men. The medieval middle class was developing concepts of private property, individual rights, and limited government that would eventually influence political developments throughout Europe and America. Their resistance to arbitrary taxation, their demands for legal protections for commercial activities, and their insistence on representation in governmental decision-making established precedents for constitutional governance and individual liberty. The international perspective developed by medieval merchants was creating the first truly global economy in human history. Their trading networks connected Europe with Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas, establishing patterns of cultural exchange and economic interdependence that would shape world history for centuries to come. The environmental impact of medieval commercial development was beginning to create the first signs of the ecological challenges that would characterize industrial civilization. The expansion of agriculture to feed growing urban populations, the development of manufacturing processes that consumed natural resources, and the growth of international trade that required extensive transportation networks established patterns of environmental exploitation that would accelerate dramatically in later centuries. Medieval merchants were also contributing to the development of modern concepts of time, efficiency, and productivity that would prove essential for industrial development. Their need to coordinate complex business activities across long distances and extended time periods led to innovations in scheduling, planning, and resource management that established precedents for modern organizational methods. The legal and institutional frameworks created to support medieval commercial activity were establishing the foundations for modern capitalism. The development of contract law, corporate organization, intellectual property rights, and financial regulation created legal structures that would prove essential for economic development in subsequent centuries. As Thomas Aldrich closed his account books and prepared for sleep, he could hardly have imagined that his daily struggles to build a successful business and provide security for his family were contributing to social and economic transformations that would eventually reshape human civilization. The medieval middle class that he represented was creating the institutional, cultural, and intellectual foundations for the modern world, establishing patterns of thought and behavior that would prove remarkably durable and influential. The legacy of medieval merchants like Thomas Aldrich extends far beyond their immediate economic contributions to encompass fundamental changes in human social organization, cultural values, and historical development. Their emphasis on education, innovation, and individual achievement helped create the intellectual and social conditions that would make possible the scientific revolution, democratic governance, and economic prosperity that characterize modern Western civilization. The story of the medieval middle class reminds us that historical change often occurs through the accumulated efforts of ordinary people pursuing their daily concerns rather than through the dramatic actions of kings and conquerors. The merchant families of medieval England were creating the future through their mundane activities of buying and selling, teaching their children, and building relationships with their neighbors, demonstrating that history's most significant transformations often emerge from the most commonplace human experiences. In understanding the daily lives of medieval merchants and craftsmen, we gain insight not only into a fascinating historical period, but also into the origins of our own social and economic systems. The medieval middle class created many of the institutions, values, and practices that continue to shape contemporary life, making their story essential for understanding how the modern world developed from its medieval foundations. What medieval middle-class life in England was really like, *.